Hello and welcome to the Cleft Mama podcast. This is a supportive space for families navigating life with a baby diagnosed with a cleft lip and/or palate. Here we share real experiences, practical guidance, and conversations with parents and professionals to help you feel informed, supported, and less alone. I'm your host, Anja, and I'm excited to get started. Hello and welcome to another solo episode on the Cleft Mama podcast. And today I thought I'd talk about a webinar I recently attended. So that was really quite fascinating to me. It was a webinar given by Dr. Victoria Damora-Bafo, who is a paediatrician and a clinical researcher at the Komfo Anokai Teaching Hospital in Kumasi in Ghana. And I hope I pronounced her name and the hospital name right. But this was within the circle of cleft professionals that offer that webinar. So I joined it. And the webinar was all about feeding babies with cleft lip and palate, particularly breastfeeding. And it was based on what is the common practice in Ghana. So as I was listening, I found myself taking lots of notes because it was so different to the UK, but at the same time also so interesting to me. And her team at this hospital, they see around 5 new babies with clefts every single week. And because they're one of the main cleft centers in the region, they also receive or get referrals for babies from neighboring countries even. And I just found that so fascinating, 5 new babies every single week, which is even more striking because actually clefts happen less frequent than they do in the UK. So in the UK, we know it's 1 in 700. And in people of African descent, it's actually 1 in 1,200. So seeing 5 new babies every single week was just an astounding number to me. I thought I'd dedicate an episode to sharing what I had learned in that webinar. But as always, I'm not a healthcare professional. I'm simply sharing information from this webinar alongside my own experiences. And we know that every baby is different. So also discuss feeding with your own cleft team because your baby is different to any other baby. But the very first thing that stood out to me in the way they approach things was the mindset. So their starting point isn't what bottle should we use for this baby. And instead it's, can we help this mother breastfeed? So that doesn't mean that every baby in the end will be able to breastfeed directly from the mother. And it certainly doesn't mean to put pressure on the mothers. But they don't assume breastfeeding is impossible simply because the baby has a cleft palate. So they start from the position of possibility rather than a limitation. And I really like this approach because I know so many parents are told very early on that breastfeeding simply won't work, rather than trying to find ways of how it can possibly work. So in this webinar, Dr. Bafo explained that many mothers arrive at their clinic already feeling defeated. So sometimes they try to breastfeed and then they got some remarks from family members. And also midwives would have told them that breastfeeding isn't possible. And even more surprisingly, some have been told by healthcare professionals that breastfeeding could somehow make the cleft worse or make the gap wider actually. And we know there simply isn't any evidence for that. So instead of reinforcing those fears, the team spends a huge amount of time building the mother's confidence. So they're bringing them in and they're working closely with them to bring down those myths or those beliefs. And when they see them the very first time, they also encourage the moms to breastfeed and to see how the baby is latching and so on. They really like to see the babies as soon as possible after the referral. And for all of those babies, the cleft was only discovered after birth, so they're not detected antenatally. So those babies can be a few days old up to several weeks old. But they're really trying, first of all, to get the babies to the breast. And even if there is no actual milk being transferred. Just having them close to the mom's breast is already beneficial in and of itself. But they also talk a lot to the moms while breast milk itself matters. And we all know that there are many well-established benefits, but it does provide the ideal nutrition for those babies. The antibodies in the breast milk will help fight infections, and they support the brain development. And there are benefits for the mothers too, including supporting the recovery after the birth and reducing the long-term risks of certain cancers. So this is, again, even more important in areas where there might not be ideal nutrition otherwise being available. So the breast milk is always available and it's already at the right temperature. The mothers wouldn't need to sterilize bottles or prepare formula. And again, there are some difficulties with that in itself. So they might not be able to sterilize any material or any bottles. And in countries like Ghana, formula can also be incredibly expensive. So the financial benefit of using breast milk instead of formula is also enormous. So when the mothers first come in, as I mentioned, they really want to see how they are feeding the baby or what they are trying. And they really teach the mother. So they use demonstration dolls and model breasts to show different positions of how to hold the baby. And they're trying like different ways, and it's whatever is most comfortable for the mother in combination with the baby. And if the baby only has a cleft lip, then that can actually help to really encourage normal direct breastfeeding, and that works. But also for cleft palate, what they really pointed out that it's not simply about creating the suction. So we know that when the baby has a cleft palate, they can't breastfeed because they can't create the vacuum. But their approach really explains that the milk can reach the baby in several ways. So yes, suction is one of them, and that's the most, a crucial one. But the baby can also compress the breast with their tongue and palate and then encourage some of the milk to flow. And then there's also the mother's letdown reflex, where the milk is simply released from the breast, which can then go into the baby's mouth. So even if the suction is perfect, the babies can still receive some milk directly from the breast. And this is a good starting point. So they still obviously monitor how much the baby is actually having. And quite often, this alone might not be sufficient. But then they also teach how to hand express, and so to encourage the moms to express their milk and then feed that on top of what the baby would get directly from breastfeeding. So also many mothers pump alongside breastfeeding to protect their milk supply. And then the baby is getting given additional milk as well. And what was, again, very interesting here, so instead of using bottles, they use something called the Nifty cup. And I had not heard about it before, but it's a little soft silicone cup, which has like a small reservoir thing at the end. So the moms can actually express directly into the cup. And then it also has some scale on the side to see the volume that's in the cup. So then moms can also see how much the baby actually has. And then this Nifty cup is kind of placed in the baby's mouth, but the milk isn't poured into the baby. So the baby kind of just laps it from that reservoir part with their tongue. So similar a bit to a cat that is lapping milk. And the baby then can control the pace. So then feeding is again a bit more natural than squeezing milk with a bottle into their mouth. What's really important about this Nifty cup, it's reusable. It's very easy to clean. It can just be cleaned with water and soap. It's easy to sterilize as well, which again are just some very important points where this cup is then preferred over bottles, for example, that are not so easy to clean and sterilize. When this milk is then given, the babies are also in a normal feeding position. The babies are always kept upright with their head and neck supported because there are still some common concerns that the mothers have when they're coming to that clinic. So the milk can be coming out of the baby's nose, and that is common with cleft palate. And we understand that can look very alarming, but quite often it improves as the babies grow and learn how to coordinate the feeding. But keeping the babies upright can also help reduce this. Then some of the parents obviously are also worrying when the baby coughs or splutters. And again, that can happen, but just holding them in a upright position and pace how to give the milk. So not actually pouring it into the baby's mouth, but letting them dictate the pace often can make a difference there. The babies are still being monitored and they're weighed regularly. So if the babies aren't gaining enough weight, then again, they don't simply assume it's because of the cleft and they just rule out any other medical causes. And only then, if anything else is ruled out and they can be certain that the breast milk alone is not enough. And again, we have to keep in mind here that's in a context where the nutrition for the mother might also be insufficient. So here, if the breast milk alone isn't enough, then they consider supplementation with formula. So they also kind of ensure the mothers that babies with clefts will not automatically choke or aspirate if they're breastfed, which is again something that the mothers may have heard and why they're so concerned about feeding their babies. Aspirations where some of the milk goes into the airways of the baby, that can occur, particularly if they have other airway problems, but it's rare. And you would know what to look out for and how to avoid that. So they're monitoring the babies, as I said, and they teach the moms what to look out for. Then we also know that the babies swallow huge amounts of air. And yes, they can swallow some air, but most babies, they will simply burp it back up. And we know that ourselves from our babies. But one of the very key parts of their success, I guess, in supporting moms is the supportive programs they have. So they have a lot of emphasis on psychosocial support for the mothers. And first of all, they need to also address the stigma and the anxiety that the mothers have based on what they have heard. They need to understand that it's not them that have caused the cleft. They need to have confidence. And they actually set up WhatsApp groups for the moms that are coming in, like in the same cohort. And they said this is where the moms can really share their worries openly and where they can be vulnerable and support each other. So I thought that was just great that they have specific WhatsApp groups for the moms who are breastfeeding cleft babies. And they obviously looked how successful their program is. And it's again very interesting. In Ghana, among babies without clefts, around 70% were exclusively breastfed at 6 months. So that's incredible. Like, it's so much lower in the UK. But again, we also have to keep it in the context that formula is very expensive there. And actually, formula feeding has been seen to also lead to malnutrition there because moms may not mix it at the ratio that should be given because they just might use a bit more water to stretch it for longer because it's so expensive. But so without clefts, they're about 70% exclusively breastfed. And then amongst the babies with clefts and where the mothers attended the clinics with the babies, at 6 months, 50% achieved still exclusive breastfeeding. So I found that very, very incredible. And those are babies with cleft lip and palate. So I found that really encouraging. And they obviously also show if they're gaining enough weight. And amongst the babies that they have seen at 3 months, around 73% of them showed adequate weight gain. So yeah, I just found that all very interesting. And some of the attendees actually asked, so when are bottles being used? And as a default, they are not used in that clinic. If parents have heard of bottles before, they came across a bottle and they're using it and it works, so the baby is gaining enough weight, then they leave them to it, so they don't take the bottle away from them. They can keep going with the bottle. But it's not being introduced there at all. Instead, they use this Nifty cup, given that it's also easier to clean and sterilize. And it does work for the babies to still get the breast milk. So yeah, it's just so different. I hope that you found this episode interesting. So the webinars from the Circle of Cleft Professionals are freely available on YouTube. So I will put a link to that in the show notes. And I hope you found it as interesting as I did, because I always like to know how clefts are being treated or cared for all around the world. So have a look at that if you're interested as well. And I see you next time. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Cleft Mama podcast. I hope you get a ton of value out of our time together. You're not alone in this journey. And remember, you're doing an amazing job. If this episode helped you, please follow and share it with another parent who might benefit from it. See you next time.